I knew something inside me had shattered the moment I opened my eyes and felt the uneven weight on my head. A single glance in the mirror showed the damage. My hair, brutally trimmed while I slept, stolen from me without a word. But the real wound came after, when my own child looked at me with a coldness I had never seen and said it was a lesson. In that instant, the home I had poured my life into no longer felt like mine, and the people I trusted most became strangers. What followed changed everything, slowly, painfully, and irrevocably. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how our stories connect people from all around the world. Your comments and thoughts bring this community to life, and we are grateful to have you on this journey with us. If you have not already, do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a cozy seat, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and prepare yourself for a tale that will captivate your heart from beginning to end. Let's begin. My name is Margaret Coleman, though most people in my circle call me Maggie. I am 62 years old, a widow of 7 years, and I live alone in a wooden 3-story house in Colorado Springs. The house sits near the base of the Pikes Peak mountain range, where the air always smells faintly of pine, and the evenings arrive with a cold, honest stillness that feels like a companion rather than a threat. I often think that silence has become the language of my days, a steady backdrop against which I measure the rhythm of my own breathing. This home is more than timber and stone. It is the place where my husband, Tom, planted a small lemon tree in the backyard and promised that it would outlive us. It is where he fixed the old bookshelf by the fireplace, lining it with travel journals he never had time to finish. Each morning, when the mountain light slides slowly through the windows, those memories seem to grow brighter instead of fading. I walk through the hallway with the same caution one uses when handling a cherished photograph, as though touching the air might disturb something sacred. My long silver hair has become a part of that sacred space. It falls past my shoulders, and I have cared for it with the same gentleness I once used on Tom's medical bandages. It is the last thing he ever complimented before illness quieted his voice. I brush it every evening, letting the bristles pull through the strands while recalling moments when Tom would braid it during holidays or evenings after dinner. The sensation is comforting, like holding a warm memory in the present. For a while, solitude felt like a blanket, but then my son Daniel called with news that unsettled me. He had been laid off from his engineering job after a corporate restructuring, and he and his wife, Alyssa, needed a place to stay while they figured out their next steps. I told him that the upstairs floor was theirs. I told him to come home. I also transferred $2,500 each month from my pension and savings to help them recover. Maternal instinct can be a powerful and blinding force, and I felt it deeply then. Daniel has always been brilliant, but pressure weighs on him in ways he does not easily admit. Alyssa, younger than him by 5 years, is an online beauty and lifestyle personality. Her world revolves around cameras, product samples, and a curated image of elegance. In the beginning, she smiled politely and complimented my home for what she called its charming rustic appeal, though the way her eyes moved across the room suggested she imagined replacing everything she saw. Life with them settled into a pattern that felt warm on the surface. We shared Sunday dinners. I cooked meals that reminded Daniel of his childhood. He thanked me, but with each passing week, his gratitude seemed quieter, as though muffled by an invisible layer of distraction. Alyssa floated through the rooms with her phone raised, recording angles of my kitchen for her online followers. She occasionally suggested modern touches that might improve the house. I nodded out of politeness, but something inside me tightened each time. I began to sense emotional distance forming, less obvious than spoken words, but sharper than silence. Daniel spent more evenings behind their bedroom door, emerging with a distracted look, as if he lived in a separate world entirely. One night, after cleaning the kitchen, I stepped out onto the back porch. The wind stirred the pine branches, and the sky glowed in muted shades of gold. My hair lifted gently in the breeze. "I hope I did the right thing," I murmured into the quiet. The mountains did not answer, but they felt closer than anyone in the house upstairs. If you're still watching, and this moment hits you as hard as it hit me, comment number 1 below so I know you're right here with me. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. The shift began quietly, the way a draft finds its way through a sealed window. At first, I could not name it. It appeared in the form of small remarks, hurried glances, and an energy that felt ever so slightly off balance. One morning, as I walked past the kitchen, I heard Alyssa speaking into her phone about how modern women needed to stay relevant and how letting yourself go was a choice no one should make. She spoke casually, but her words drifted toward me with a pointed edge. I stood at the doorway long enough to realize she was not talking to her followers as much as she was talking about me. Over the next several days, her behavior shifted from polite suggestion to open critique. She commented on my outfits, calling them traditional in a tone that did not hide the judgment underneath. She remarked on my lack of makeup, my plain hairstyle, my preference for quiet mornings over loud music. I responded with tight smiles, the kind that ache in the jaw. Deep down, the sting settled in places even I had forgotten existed. The evening that changed my perception came unexpectedly. I entered the hallway and saw bright ring lights glowing from the living room. Alyssa was live streaming again, speaking smoothly about how older women needed to adjust their lifestyles if they wanted to stay connected to the modern world. She referred to someone who was set in her ways, someone who still clings to outdated habits, someone who never learned how to embrace change. Every description felt like a knife that fit perfectly between my ribs. I stopped just outside the camera's frame and listened as Daniel sat behind her, silent, offering no correction, no gentle reminder that I was in the next room hearing every word. His silence cut deeper than her commentary. Soon Daniel began spending less time with me. The evening teas we once shared disappeared without conversation. When I passed him on the stairs, he gave me a brief nod before hurrying to wherever Alyssa called him. I found myself wondering if I had somehow become a burden to him, though I could not pinpoint why. The first direct warning arrived one afternoon when Alyssa asked who legally owned the house. She pretended the question was part of casual conversation, but curiosity does not usually come with the calculating glimmer I saw in her eyes. She remarked that the house was too large for one person, and that selling it could be a smart, long-term move. I recognized ambition masked as concern, and the realization lodged itself uncomfortably in my chest. Financial red flags began appearing like breadcrumbs. I noticed beauty products delivered in expensive packaging, online orders I had never approved, and charges on the emergency credit card I had issued them. Everything pointed to entitlement rather than gratitude. I felt the boundaries of my household shifting, but I steadied myself, telling my heart to be patient. Alyssa began rearranging shelves and moving decorative pieces as though preparing the home for an audience. My kitchen no longer felt like mine. My living room echoed with a style that did not belong to me. I felt displaced in the house I had lived in for decades, yet I swallowed the discomfort, as I had always done when trying to preserve peace. One evening, I found a glossy real estate magazine on the table, pages marked with sticky notes. One tab circled a home with an open floor plan ideal for filming. Under the circle was Alyssa's handwriting. My pulse fluttered. That night, I stood in the hallway outside their closed door and heard muffled laughter. I felt invisible. Back in my room, I brushed my silver hair slowly, each stroke steadying my breath. Something in the house was shifting, not loudly, but like a quiet hinge turning. If you're still watching and sensing something darker beneath the surface, comment number 2 below to let me know you're following every turn. Now, let's continue with Chapter 3. The day began like many others, with a long shift at the Veterans Hospital where I volunteered twice a week. I spent hours on my feet helping patients navigate paperwork, medications, and quiet griefs they rarely spoke aloud. By the time I returned home, my legs felt heavy and my shoulders carried a familiar ache. I brewed a cup of chamomile tea, sat on the living room sofa, and let the warmth ease into my palms. The house was still, filled with the late afternoon hush that always made me feel safe. At some point, without meaning to, I drifted into sleep. When I woke, the light in the room had shifted. The tea had gone cold. My neck felt stiff from the angle I had slept in. But there was something else, something far more unsettling, though I could not immediately identify it. My head felt strangely light, the air against my neck cooler than usual. I lifted my hand to my hair, expecting the familiar weight of long silver strands. Instead, my fingers brushed against choppy edges, uneven and foreign. A pulse of confusion hit me first, followed quickly by a rising wave of dread. I stood abruptly and made my way to the hallway mirror. The reflection staring back at me did not feel like me. My hair, the one physical piece of myself I had cared for with unwavering devotion since Tom's passing, had been hacked apart. The strands were jagged, cut bluntly at uneven lengths, as if someone had attacked them rather than trimmed them. I felt my breath catch in my throat as shock slid into a deeper, heavier grief. It was as though someone had sliced through a part of my history, a part I had never meant to share or surrender. A soft sound behind me made me turn. Alyssa stepped out from the kitchen, holding a pair of scissors with casual ease. Her expression was composed, almost proud, as if she had completed a task worth admiring. She looked directly at me and said the words that would stay with me far longer than the damage she had done. "Consider this a lesson, Mom." The tone was not playful. It was not kind. It was a warning disguised as advice. Daniel appeared moments later, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. His face held none of the alarm or empathy I had hoped to find there. Instead, he offered a shallow explanation, insisting Alyssa had tried to help me look updated. His words did not soften the blow. They deepened it. The betrayal did not come from the scissors. It came from my own son standing beside the woman who had violated my trust. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I walked past them, grabbed my keys, and drove to the only place I could think of that might anchor me, the salon owned by my longtime stylist, Maria. When she saw the state of my hair, her eyes widened with the quiet outrage. She examined the uneven cuts and shook her head slowly, telling me that this kind of act was rarely about appearance and almost always about control. Her voice held a gravity that steadied me. When I returned home, the house felt different, as if the walls themselves knew a line had been crossed. I looked through the financial documents on my desk and saw new charges on the emergency credit card. There were receipts for high-end products and a marked real estate magazine on the kitchen table. Evidence of entitlement lay everywhere, unnoticed until now. That night, I sat before my vanity, touching the clipped ends of my hair. This was no longer about vanity or style. It was a rupture, a turning point. And for the first time, I understood that endurance would no longer protect me. Action would. If you're still watching and feel the tension rising, comment number 3 below so I know you're still with me. Now, let's dive into Chapter 4. The morning after the haircut incident arrived with an unsettling quiet, the kind that feels both heavy and clarifying. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, taking in the uneven strands that framed my face. The shock had settled into something steadier, something sharper. My reflection seemed older, not because of age, but because of understanding. What had been done to me was not an accident, not a misguided attempt at care. It was intentional. It was a message. And I knew I could no longer ignore the collection of warning signs that had been accumulating around me. I went to the small desk in my bedroom and opened the drawer where I kept important papers. Inside was an old envelope that held the card of Jonathan Blake, the lawyer who had served beside my late husband during their years in the military. Jonathan had attended Tom's funeral, offering a firm handshake and the assurance that I could call him if I ever needed help. I had never expected that such help would involve my own son. My hands trembled slightly as I dialed his office number, but my voice remained steady as I explained the situation. He asked me to come in later that afternoon. Before leaving the house, I began gathering evidence, not out of spite, but out of necessity. I photographed my hair carefully, making sure to capture the jagged cuts that could not be mistaken for a salon mistake. I took pictures of the scissors I had found on the kitchen counter. I spread the credit card statements across the dining table, highlighting the unfamiliar purchases, the growing list of charges that did not belong to me. I collected receipts, printed screenshots of online orders, and placed everything into a folder that felt heavier than paper should ever feel. Jonathan's office was exactly as I remembered it from years ago. Shelves lined with military memorabilia, books stacked neatly behind a polished wooden desk, and a sense of calm that came from a man who had spent his life navigating crises. He listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally as I laid out each detail. When I finished, he leaned back and studied me with an expression that balanced professional concern with personal loyalty. He reminded me that the house belonged solely to me, documented in the will Tom had carefully prepared. Daniel and Alyssa, without any written agreement, were considered tenants at will. Their financial misuse, combined with the invasion of my personal space, gave me clear legal grounds to issue a formal notice requiring them to vacate. Hearing it spoken aloud steadied something inside me. I signed the document Jonathan prepared, a 45-day notice that felt both like an anchor and a blade. Jonathan advised me to wait a few days before delivering it, not out of hesitation, but to ensure that my actions were guided by clarity rather than anger. I followed his advice. For 3 days, I observed Daniel and Alyssa quietly. Their behavior did not change. Alyssa strutted around the house rearranging shelves and filming clips for her online page. Daniel continued avoiding conversation, moving through rooms as though he belonged everywhere except near me. The distance between us felt wider than the entire house. On the 4th morning, I placed a notice on the coffee table and asked them to come downstairs. My voice did not shake as I handed them the envelope. Their reactions were immediate and predictable. Daniel stared at the paper, his face shifting from confusion to disbelief to anger. Alyssa accused me of abandoning family. Their voices rose, filling the room with heat, but I remained still. I had already made my decision. When they finally stormed out, slamming doors behind them, the house fell silent again. I returned to my bedroom, placed Jonathan's card in my nightstand, and allowed myself one slow breath. I had crossed a line I could not uncross, but I had done so to protect my dignity. And for the first time in a long while, I felt the faint beginning of strength returning to me. If you're still watching and can feel the storm beginning to build, comment number 4 below to show you're staying with the story. Now, let's move into chapter 5. The morning unfolded with an unsettling stillness, the kind that settles over a house right before everything inside it changes forever. I walked through the hallway slowly, feeling the weight of each step as though the air around me had thickened. Lake Verde shimmered quietly outside the windows, indifferent to the storm building inside my home. I had slept little, listening to the muffled pacing above me, the restless movement of 2 people who sensed that something was slipping out of their control. The silence felt fragile, as if the slightest touch could shatter it. When the doorbell finally rang, the sound cut through the quiet like a sharp blade. Mr. Benjamin Clayton stood on the porch, composed as always, holding the envelope that felt heavier than any legal document should. His presence alone made my heart ache with a mixture of fear and certainty. I invited him in and guided him toward the living room, a room that had once held Christmas mornings, birthday dinners, and evenings filled with laughter. Today, it felt more like a stage set for a confrontation no one wanted, but everyone expected. I heard slow footsteps descending the stairs before I even called their names. Daniel entered first, shoulders tense, face drawn tight with suspicion. Alyssa followed closely, arms crossed, her expression sharp enough to cut through glass. When Mr. Clayton handed them the envelope, the crackle of paper seemed louder than it should have been. Daniel opened it, eyes scanning the page. I watched the transformation ripple across his face. Surprise, confusion, anger. Then something deeper, something that made my stomach twist. He finally spoke, his voice cold. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. Alyssa stepped closer, pouring venom into the moment, insisting that I was tearing apart a family, that I was abandoning them, that I was cruel. Their accusations struck me with more force than I expected, not because their words were true, but because they came from mouths I had once fed, sheltered, and trusted. I stood still, holding my ground, even as tension vibrated in the air around us. When Mr. Clayton quietly mentioned that Alyssa had called his office a week ago to ask whether my house could be transferred into Daniel's name if I became unfit, the room seemed to tilt. I stared at her, stunned. Daniel looked genuinely shocked, insisting he knew nothing about it. Alyssa tried to recover, claiming she was only exploring options for family stability, but the crack in her confidence was visible. The argument erupted then, raw and unfiltered. Daniel accused me of betraying him, of choosing pride over family. Alyssa accused me of holding on to the past instead of making space for their future. Their voices rose, colliding, bouncing off the walls that had once protected us all. Every sentence felt like a fresh blow. I felt my heart bruising with each accusation. Yet beneath the pain, I also felt something steadier forming, like the spine I had forgotten I had. I finally spoke, not loudly, but firmly, telling them that this house was my safe place, that the boundaries they had crossed could not go unaddressed, and that this decision was not born from spite, but from necessity. They did not want to hear it. Daniel dropped the notice on the table and stormed upstairs, footsteps pounding with fury. Alyssa followed, slamming the door behind her. The house fell quiet again, but it was not the same silence that had lingered earlier. This one felt colder, heavier, like the aftermath of a storm that had torn through everything soft and left only the hard, immovable pieces behind. I stood alone in the center of the living room, absorbing the ache, the shock, and the grim clarity. Something had broken that morning, something that could not be repaired. And yet, beneath the wreckage, a small truth glowed quietly. I had finally chosen myself. The hush that settled over the house after Daniel and Alyssa retreated upstairs felt heavier than any shouting match ever could. I remained in the living room, staring at the closed doorway at the top of the stairs, listening to the distant thumps of footsteps and slammed drawers. It was astonishing how quickly a home could turn into a battlefield, and how fast the pieces of a relationship could scatter across the floor like broken porcelain. For a moment, I stood frozen, feeling the tremor in my own hands, a quiet reminder that even a strong heart can bruise. I retreated to my bedroom, closing the door softly behind me. The afternoon sun reflected off Lake Verde, illuminating the room in a soft, warm glow that clashed painfully with the turmoil inside me. I sat by the window and watched the faint ripple of water against the dock. Every part of me wanted to stop feeling the weight of what had just happened downstairs, yet it clung stubbornly, refusing to fade. I had imagined many painful scenarios in my life, but never the one in which I would have to defend myself against my own child. As I stared out at the view that had comforted me through grief, loneliness, and recovery, memories flooded back. I thought of the winters when I worked late shifts to keep the mortgage paid, trudging home through icy streets just to check on Daniel's sleeping form. I thought of the mornings when I packed his lunches, the school plays I attended even when exhaustion tugged at my bones, and the small victories I celebrated only because they were his. It dawned on me with piercing clarity that perhaps I had loved him in a way that left no room for him to grow. I had given him everything, except the space to learn how to stand alone. My phone rang, jarring me from my thoughts. The caller identification displayed a number from Orlando. A representative from the bank confirmed that they had received a request earlier that morning regarding a change in access for one of my savings accounts. The request was incomplete, but flagged because the address and Wi-Fi information matched my home. My breath stalled. Someone had tried to alter my financial access without speaking a word to me. When I ended the call, my pulse raced with a mix of betrayal and resolve. I walked downstairs, moving with a numb steadiness, and found the tablet Alyssa used sitting on the kitchen counter. The screen had not locked yet. A tab was open, displaying a partially completed transfer authorization form from my bank. I stared at it for several seconds, my mind silent, my chest tightening in a way that felt more like armor forming than heartbreak. Whatever naive hope I had held, that this conflict was only emotional, vanished. This was no longer miscommunication or tension. This was intrusion. This was intent. I spent the rest of the afternoon alone, contemplating what was left to salvage and what needed to be left behind. The sun sank beyond the line of distant trees before I heard a soft knock at my door. Daniel entered with hesitant steps, staying near the threshold as though unsure whether he deserved to cross it. He attempted to reason with me, saying he needed more time, saying he felt lost, saying everything would be easier if I simply withdrew the eviction notice. His voice trembled, but the words felt borrowed, shadowed by someone else's influence. I listened, but the decision had already settled inside me like a stone placed deliberately in the right spot. Choosing myself was not abandonment. It was survival. When I told him my choice stood, his shoulders slumped. He nodded once, not in agreement but in resignation, and left the room quietly. When the door closed, I looked at my reflection in the window. For the first time in years, the woman staring back at me looked certain of herself. If you're still watching and the turning point caught your breath, comment number 6 below so I know you're with me. Now, let's continue to Chapter 7. The next morning unfolded with a stillness so dense it seemed to settle on my skin. When I stepped into the hallway, the house felt hollow, as if the arguments and accusations from the day before had scraped the walls clean of air. I descended the stairs slowly, each step echoing louder than usual, and paused in the living room. The silence was not peaceful. It was the kind that follows destruction, the kind that forces you to acknowledge what has been lost. My body felt heavier than it had in years, as though the emotional weight had seeped into my bones overnight. From upstairs came the muffled sounds of movement, drawers opening, suitcases being zipped, the dull thud of shoes against the floorboards. It was a strange thing, hearing people prepare to leave your home without a single word exchanged. I remained in the kitchen doorway, listening with a quiet ache spreading through my chest. There was no apology, no attempt at resolution, not even a final glance to acknowledge the years we had shared. Instead, they seemed determined to slip away before I could speak another word that challenged them. I caught a glimpse of them through the window as they loaded the car. Daniel walked quickly, keeping his eyes fixed straight ahead. Alyssa moved with practiced efficiency, her face set in a cold expression that revealed nothing. When the trunk closed and the engine started, I waited for Daniel to look back. I waited with a hope so fragile it might have dissolved at the slightest breath. But he did not. The car rolled down the driveway, its taillights shrinking until they disappeared around the curve. The absence they left behind settled into the house like a cold draft. My phone buzzed relentlessly over the next few hours. When I checked it, I found an avalanche of messages from people I did not know. Some accused me of being controlling. Others repeated lines that sounded scripted directly from Alyssa's curated image. A few messages were harsh enough to make my hands shake. Apparently, Alyssa had shared her version of the story online, painting herself as a victim of an unreasonable older woman. I placed the phone face down on the counter and refused to respond. I had no desire to feed a fire built entirely on performance. Later that afternoon, when I stepped out to run a few errands, neighbors noticed the strain on my face. Several stopped to ask if I needed help. A woman from down the street pressed a warm hand to my shoulder, and one of the veterans from the hospital recognized me and offered gentle encouragement. Their kindness felt like small lanterns lighting the dark path beneath my feet. It reminded me that real communities existed outside the storm of online outrage. News about Daniel reached me through a friend in town who worked at a staffing agency. He told me Daniel had struggled in several interviews. Potential employers had seen Alyssa's broadcasts, and the impression left behind did not benefit him. I listened quietly, not with satisfaction, but with a sadness that pooled somewhere deep. A mother can grieve even when her hands are clean. By late afternoon, a final piece of news arrived in the form of a hesitant phone call. Someone had seen Alyssa boarding a flight to California with a wealthy sponsor who had appeared frequently in her social media circles. She had left Daniel behind without explanation. For a long moment, I could not speak. Betrayal has an echo, and perhaps now Daniel heard his own. When evening fell, I moved through the now quiet house, noting the hollow spaces where tension used to linger. It was cleaner, calmer, but unbearably empty. I made myself a cup of tea and stood at the kitchen window, watching the last of the lights settle over the lake. The pain was real. The loss was real. Yet beneath it all, there was a small, steady truth. The storm had passed, and I was still standing. The house felt different in the days after Daniel and Alyssa left. It was quieter, cleaner, more orderly, but also strangely hollow, as though every room carried the faint echo of something unresolved. When I woke on the first morning alone, the absence of noise struck me more sharply than any argument ever had. I sat at the edge of my bed for a long moment, staring at the sunlight gathering on the floorboards, trying to understand the shape of the emptiness around me. It was not peace yet. It was simply space, raw, honest space I had not felt in months. I moved slowly through the house, returning items to their proper places. I wiped down the kitchen counters, restoring the arrangement I had kept for years. I folded blankets that had been tossed carelessly across the sofa, swept away stray strands of hair from the hallway, and reclaimed corners of my home Alyssa had taken over for her videos. Each motion felt like a stitch in a fabric that had been torn too many times. I opened the windows, letting in the crisp afternoon breeze. The air smelled like pine again. The house seemed to breathe with me. Later that day, I gathered a few bags of unused items to donate to the community center. I expected nothing more than a quiet drop-off, but when I walked into the lobby, I froze. Daniel was there, standing near a table of volunteer forms. He looked older somehow, worn down by something heavier than stress. His shoulders sagged, and there were shadows beneath his eyes. For a moment, I simply watched him, noticing the way he avoided meeting the eyes of others, the way he clutched a folder as if it were anchoring him. When he turned and saw me, there was a flicker of surprise, followed by something softer. He approached slowly, like someone uncertain whether he was welcome. I felt my heart shift inside my chest, but I held myself still. He spoke only a few sentences, enough to reveal the truth I already knew. Alyssa had left him. He had no job lined up, and he did not know how to begin again. His voice lacked the defensive sharpness I had grown used to. It carried exhaustion, humility, and a quiet plea for direction. I listened without letting my instinct rush ahead of me. For years, my response would have been to gather him up, to erase every hardship in his way. But I understood now that loving him required a different kind of strength. I suggested he look for temporary housing and reminded him that starting over was still possible. When he hesitated, I offered him the small cabin near the edge of my property, a space of his own, not an invitation to return to the old patterns. He nodded with genuine relief, and this time he did not demand anything more. Over the next few days, I arranged therapy sessions for both of us, following the guidance of my lawyer. To my surprise, Daniel agreed without argument. Sitting across from him in the quiet office felt unfamiliar, but promising. We were not healed, not even close, but there was a tentative willingness to understand each other. That alone felt like progress. One evening, after returning home from a session, I stepped onto the porch and looked out at the lake. The sky had faded into soft blue, and the water reflected the peaceful shift of early nightfall. For the first time in a long while, I felt a small but steady sense of hope. I was still grieving, still rebuilding, but I was moving forward. And for now, that was enough. If you're still watching and ready to see how everything comes full circle, comment number 8 below to stay on this journey with me. Now, let's head into the final chapters. A full year passed before I realized how far I had come from the chaos that once consumed my home. Life settled into a gentler rhythm, one shaped by quiet mornings, warm cups of tea, and the steady comfort of a house that finally felt like mine again. The walls no longer carried echoes of arguments or tense footsteps. Instead, they held soft reminders that healing can grow in the empty spaces grief leaves behind. I often walked through the room slowly, taking in the peace that had taken so long to reclaim. Daniel's life had changed too. After months of persistence, he secured a position at a climate technology company in the neighboring town. It was not glamorous, but it was stable, honest work. He rented a modest apartment and began managing his own bills, cooking his own meals, and building routines not dependent on anyone else. Each update he shared with me carried a quiet pride. The defensiveness that once shadowed his voice had faded, replaced by something steadier, more grounded. For the first time in years, I saw the man inside the boy I had tried so hard to protect. News of Alyssa reached me in fragments from people who followed online trends more closely than I ever would. Her leap to California had not unfolded as she expected. Brands distanced themselves from her after the controversy she created. Followers questioned her authenticity. Opportunities she once flaunted slipped out of reach. Eventually, she faded from the spotlight she had chased so fiercely. I felt no satisfaction hearing it. Instead, I felt an unexpected sadness for someone who had built a world on illusion and then watched it collapse. But her story was no longer tied to mine, and I let the thought drift away. My own life expanded in ways I had not imagined. Drawing from my experiences, I created a small support group at the community center called Restore Your Place. It became a space for women who had been manipulated, financially exploited, or worn down by those closest to them. Each session felt like laying another brick on the foundation of a life rebuilt. I shared what I had learned, listened to what others carried, and found meaning in the act of helping without losing myself again. On my 63rd birthday, Daniel arrived at my doorstep holding a simple gift wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a wooden hairbrush, smooth and polished. The gesture was small but full of tenderness, a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had been broken and everything we were rebuilding. He sat beside me on the porch, and for a while we watched the sun sink behind the mountains without speaking. The silence was no longer heavy. It was peaceful, familiar, and healing. As the evening deepened, I studied the face of my grown son. There were lines of worry and traces of regret, but also signs of genuine transformation. I felt a stirring of pride that did not demand anything in return. Love, I realized, could be steady without being sacrificial. Later, after he left, I stood alone on the porch. The fading light cast long shadows across the lake, and a cool breeze touched my hair. I breathed in deeply, feeling the weight of the past year settle in a place that no longer hurt. My future stretched quietly before me, intact and entirely mine. There are mornings when I step onto the deck of my lakeside home and feel the quiet settle around me like a soft blanket. The air is crisp, the water calm, and for a moment I stand completely still, letting the peace seep into the spaces that once held fear and doubt. A year ago, I could not have imagined feeling whole again. Now, I can look at my reflection in the glass door and recognize the woman staring back. I see strength where there used to be hesitation, and clarity where there once was confusion. As I sip my coffee, I reflect on everything that has happened. I lost things that mattered deeply: my trust, my long silver hair that symbolized decades of love and memory, and the sense of safety inside my own home. Yet I gained something far more valuable. I reclaimed my dignity, my independence, and the authority to say what is acceptable in my life. That transformation did not arrive gently. It came through fire, through betrayal, and through the painful awareness that love cannot survive without respect. Daniel's growth remains one of the most profound reminders of the importance of boundaries. When I told him he needed to leave, it felt like tearing out a piece of my own heart. But watching him rebuild his life, work steadily, and become a man capable of respecting himself and others reminds me that sometimes love requires distance, not indulgence. It was not a punishment. It was an invitation for him to rise. And for every woman who sits in her kitchen wondering whether she is asking for too much by demanding kindness, I want to say this clearly: you are not. You deserve to be valued. You deserve to feel safe. You deserve a life that reflects the worth you carry simply by existing. Speaking up for yourself is not cruelty. It is courage. As the sun glints across the surface of the lake, I close my eyes and breathe deeply. My life is no longer defined by what was taken from me, but by what I chose to rebuild. And if there is one truth I want others to hold close, it is this: it is never too late to reclaim your place in your own story. There are seasons in life when the ground shifts beneath our feet, forcing us to confront what we once accepted in silence. Yet, it is often in these ruptures that we uncover our truest strength. We learn that dignity is not something granted by others, but something reclaimed through the quiet courage to say enough. Healing is rarely a straight path. It twists through grief, clarity, and awakening, eventually leading us back to ourselves. And in that return, we discover that starting over is not a failure, but a profound act of self-respect. Life has a way of restoring balance. It lifts those who choose growth and humbles those who build on deception. What matters most is the decision to stand firmly in one's worth, to honor the voice that whispers, "You deserve better." Thank you for staying with this story. If it moved you, share your thoughts below, subscribe, and join us for more journeys of resilience and renewal.